All right, looking at the judgment of nations. Judgment of nations is a common theme throughout the Bible. And it all goes back to Genesis chapter 12. When God called Abraham and gave him the Abrahamic covenant, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. In Genesis chapter 15, then God told Abraham to prepare a sacrifice in order to ensure the covenant, to ratify the covenant. And he told him to get the different animals and to gather them together, put half the animals on one side, half on the other side, one of the birds on one side, with the bird on the other side, and then to build a fire, to burn the sacrifices. But there was a path in between the sacrifices. And the path was for two people, and this was a common type of sacrifice that they would make with someone. You know, if you agree with me, we'll do this, and together we will walk down the midst of the sacrifice, and that will be a covenant that I will keep my part if you keep your part. And so this is the type of sacrifice God gave Abraham. So Abraham assumed that him and God would go down to the midst of the sacrifice. Well, he sat there, and he had to shoo the flies away from the sacrifice because God wasn't coming. Then God put Abraham to sleep. And when God put Abraham to sleep, then God says, pass through the midst of the sacrifice. And what that meant was, it was an unconditional covenant. A conditional is, I will if you will. Unconditional, God said, I will. So it had nothing to do with Abraham, had nothing to do with Israel. Even today, it has nothing to do with Israel, whether Israel is a good nation or a bad nation. The covenant is, God says, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. So Israel could be wicked today, and a nation oppose Israel, and God will still judge that nation for opposing Israel. Because it doesn't matter. God tells us today that we're to pray for Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and I believe we are to support Israel. And as long as we do that as a nation, I think that we will survive. But when we stop doing that, and in some ways we are, then I think America's going to be in trouble. If you look at world history, from our church history, throughout the ages, anytime a nation has opposed Israel, they have suffered for it. If Hitler had not been determined to exterminate all of the Jews, Germany may have won that war. Because Hitler put so much time and effort and money into killing the Jews that he took away from the warfare. If he'd went into Poland at first, and over a couple of years' time, all he did was Poland, he would have taken Poland. Nobody would stop him. And if he'd went into another country, same thing is true. But he tried to do it all by killing the Jews, and therefore God judged him for that. Stalin in 1953, on March 2nd of 1953, Joseph Stalin, proposed of killing all the Jews in the Soviet Union. And there were somewhere around 3 million Jews at that time. 6 million had been killed in World War II. And so here, just 8 years later, he decides he wants to get rid of all the Jews in the Soviet Union. And so he proposes a way to do that. He makes up a plot saying that the Jews are trying to overtake the government. And so he said, we're going to kill all the Jews that are overtaking the government, and the rest of the Jews we are going to send to Siberia. But we're going to put them on trains and then have people along the way at every train stop kill some of the Jews. And that was his plan. And so if that plan had went into effect, Anya wouldn't be here today. Because her father is like, I don't know if you do know, did you know Anya? Her father was Jewish and worked for the government in the Soviet Union. And he would have been killed. Right? But because what happened is that Stalin, during that time, suffered a stroke and ended up dying a couple of days later. And on March the 8th, I think it was March 8th, maybe March 9th, maybe March 8th, his body lay in state at that time when it came, and that was the last day of Purim. Now Purim is in the book of Esther, and that when Haman made a decree to kill all the Jews, they cast lots to kill the Jews. And the lots were called Pur. Two of them or more would be Purim. I at the end makes it plural. And so he cast lots on the 12th month, on the 13th day of that month, all the Jews to be exterminated. Because his plot was overtaken, and Esther and Mordecai devised a way basically stop that, on the next day would have been the Feast of Purim. And so the book of Esther, Purim celebrates the victory of the Jews. Stalin dies and his bodily estate during the Feast of Purim. And is that coincidence? I don't think so. I mean, his goal was to exterminate the Jews of the Soviet Union. It failed. Hitler failed. All events before that throughout history, the Catholic Church tried its best to kill all of the Jews. During the Middle Ages, the Crusades, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church found you. If you were a Protestant, they gave you an opportunity to convert to Catholicism. If you were a Jew, they put you to death. And they suffered greatly for that as well. Well, the judgment of nations is based upon that same principle. In the Old Testament, throughout books, Amos, other books, Isaiah, several different Old Testament books talks about judgment of nations. And they're all judged on one criteria, on how they treated Israel. The Moabites were judged because during some of the wars of Israel, the Moabites came in and captured some Israelis and made them slaves out of them. God judged them for that. Even Babylon, who God wanted to go in and capture Judah, God then judged Babylon for what they did. Now, that sounds almost hypocritical. God says, I want you to do this, and I'm going to judge you for it. And that's not the case. God wanted them to do that, but what happened was the Babylonians were far more wicked in their capturing. They ended up killing 2/3 of all the Jews. And God just simply wanted them to go in and take control. But because of their harshness, God judged them for that. And every other nation throughout history. Any nation today that opposes Israel, God will judge. And this is what's going to take place at the end of the millennial kingdom. Now, I don't understand really all the events here. I understand the judgment, but I really don't understand why. Be honest with you, but because what's going to happen, the nations will be judged, and whatever nation is found righteous will be in the millennial kingdom. A judgment a nation not found righteous in their treating of Israel will not be in the millennial kingdom. I don't really, be honest with you yet, I don't know why we care. However, God does, and that makes it important. God says these things will happen. But we have to be careful about this passage because people really get this one confused today. The sheep and goat judgment. People think of sheep and goat judgment, they think of saved and unsaved. That the sheep are the saved and the goats are the unsaved. And that is not what it's talking about here. It says this, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goat on his left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye bless my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Now it kind of sounds like saved and lost here. Right? However, and the king answered and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, and this is the basis of the judgment, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. And what it's talking about here, and repeat here, he said that the base of the judgment is this. For I was hungry, and you gave me no meat. This is the negative part of the judgment. Telling him, I was hungry, but you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in, naked, and you clothed me not, sick and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee a hungry, or a thirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not unto one of the least of these, you did it not to me. Now, verses prior to this, Jesus said, Because I was hungry, you fed me. Because I was naked, you clothed me. Because I was thirsty, you gave me drink. that is not the basis for salvation. Right? If it were, then it'd be work salvation. So it can't be talking about saved and lost here with the sheep and goat judgment. It's not talking about individual people's judgment, because the judgment would be, you're a sheep if you gave me food, therefore you get to heaven. Well, that's work salvation, so it can't be that. So it has to be something different than that. And the Bible does say that it's a judgment of nations. It doesn't say it's a judgment of people. It's a judgment of nations. And when we get to heaven, there's only one judgment that we will face, and that's a judgment seat of Christ, and that's a good thing. Right? We hear that word judgment, and we immediately think that it's negative. If you judge somebody, what does that mean?
Kind of put them down.
That's what we tend to say. But could I not say, I judge Tony, of all I've seen in his life, all the years I've known him, I could judge him to be faithful in his service to God. And that's a proper judgment. Right? But we're human, we tend to think of the negative more than we do the positive. So our judgment seat is a positive thing. We won't be judged as for our salvation, because if you're there, you're saved. The only people who make it to the judgment seat of Christ are saved. Our works will be judged on whether we were faithful to serve God. And then the works that we were faithful, and we get the gold, silver, or precious stone, that means that's how much God will give us authority over in the millennial kingdom. And we'll all have certain roles in the millennial kingdom, whatever they might be. I have no idea what they'll be. I don't know how it'll be divided up, but God will, if we were faithful over 10, God will give us reward us for that. But here is talking about how you treated, well, who? Well, God's people. Who's God's people? It's Israel. And so the judgment here is those nations who did not support Israel, God will get rid of. And the nations that did support Israel, God will keep. Now, I do know of 3 nations today that won't be in the millennial kingdom. 4 won't be in the millennial kingdom. Jordan won't be there. Saudi Arabia won't be there. Iraq won't be there. Iran won't be there. And I know they won't be there. Why? Because they're living on Israel's property today. That will all belong to Israel. However, Egypt will be there. I kind of thinking, well, why would Egypt be there? I mean, Egypt today is a Muslim nation. You know, they don't have the best history. However, God will have them there. Zechariah talks about Egypt in the millennial kingdom. So that's, again, it's God's judgment, it's not our judgment. 1967, Egypt decided to war against Israel, and it was called the 6-Day War because it lasted 6 days. Well, I say that. How long did the 100 Years' War last? Like 120, I think it was. So we're not good at naming wars, I guess. But anyway, that's how long that war lasted, and immediately it was stopped. But going on back through history, in the Old Testament, it was Egypt that basically made Israel a nation. When Joseph and his people went into Egypt, Joseph was elevated to a high position. Of course, they ended up being enslaved and kicked out of Egypt, or were allowed to leave Egypt. And they had little skirmishes after that, but not really much. So why are they there? I don't know. But again, it's God's judgment. And it cannot be a judgment upon individuals. You'll see these verses down at the soup kitchen downtown, was it Samaritan, whatever, on the outside it says, I was hungry and you fed me. And people think, well, that's talking about the church today and the church's responsibility to feed the hungry. No, it's not. Now, should the church feed the hungry? Yes. If we give them the gospel. I don't think it's important that we feed people if we're going to let them go to hell. Right? You do both. You know, if missionaries go and build wells, that's good. But if they build wells just to give them water, they're not really helping them. you're allowing them to grow up and die and go to hell. If they build wells in order to get them the gospel, that's a good thing. To give people food, to give them the gospel, that's a good thing. Right? But just to feed them is not important, because they're still lose their soul. The important thing here, Jesus says, is I will judge you positive if you fed me. I will judge you negative if you didn't feed me. And so again, it can't be individual salvation, because that's not the basis for our salvation. All right, we'll go ahead and stop right there. In a different area next week. Get through the letter tonight.